Hey guys, I'm Dov, and today I'm back with more Total War Warhammer 2 online action. We're going to be continuing our discussion about magic today. We're going to be looking at Lore of Life and Lore of Death in the same replay and talking about what makes them such common picks and such safe picks. So let's go ahead and take a look at the army compositions, and then we can kind of talk about things from there. This is a similar build to what I picked up from some tournament players who played in the Total War Fantasy League this last week. It's a very heavy Wood Elf flying build here. We've got a Glade Lord and 2 Forest Dragons. Typically, I'm not the biggest fan of the Forest Dragons because they only have 50 armor. They can take a lot of missile fire, but they do have heavy magic poison damage with heavy armor piercing, and they're, let's see here, I'm not even going to try and pronounce that, soporific breath, something like that. It doesn't do the most damage, but it does do quite a bit of damage and can definitely be pretty powerful, especially with 2 units of them. We've got the Glady up on the Eagle here, 1 unit of Way Watchers and Vanguard with another out on the far side, and then the rest of my army is going to be hidden over in the forest here. We've got 1 unit of Wild Riders, 4 Eternal Guards with a War Dancer, and here is the casters. So, we've got a Spell Singer Lore of Life equipped with the standard healing spells, so Earthblood and Regrowth. And yeah, that's going to be it for myself. For the Chaos player here, we've got a Chaos Sorcerer Lord, Lore of Death, up on a dragon, which is one of the most powerful caster characters in the game. In this particular guy's got heavy AP, decent combat stats, fire damage. Of course, he's also got access to Lore of Death, being a Sorcerer Lord, so he's got Spirit Leech and Fate of Buna, which is kind of the counterpart to Earthblood and Regrowth, which is why I figured it would be a good opportunity to talk about these 2 lords in a little bit of detail. We've also got lots of Marauder Horsemen here with throwing axes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Marauders with throwing axes. Infantry Corps is going to be 1 Chaos Chariot. We've got some Chaos Warriors with halberds. 2 of them, 3 of them, in fact. 2, 3 Forsaken, and a couple of single Chaos Warrior and a single Chaos Marauder. So a nice wide army. Let's go ahead and kick it into full gear. We'll kind of talk about some things. So why are Lore of Life and Lore of Death such common picks in Total War Warhammer? Well, number 1, because they're safe picks. You cast Fate of Buna, and you're guaranteed that it's going to do a certain amount of damage. Granted, you have to cast it on the appropriate unit, and that's up to you to do. But it's not like another damage area of effect spell like a wind spell or a bombardment. It's direct damage, so it's guaranteed to deal damage. Same thing with Spirit Leech, which is good against single model entities. It's guaranteed to deal damage, which is why it's such a safe pick. Because you're not going to worry that, like Doombolt, for example, can miss, or another magic missile spell that's good at hitting characters has the potential to miss. So it's typically less risk, and the way the game should be balanced, less reward as a result. Now, whether that is always the case is it's been subject to debate in the various patches of Total War Warhammer, but Earthblood is the same thing. Now, healing is arguably more useful than direct damage because, you know, you can negate any kind of damage that's taken. And Earthblood and Regrowth are the 2 safe healing spells because you're guaranteed healing. There's not really any area of effect healing spells, although that would be kind of cool, or rather, what I mean by that is like a wind healing spell. You know, there's not a wind of life, for example. So these spells are guaranteed to heal, you know, a certain amount based on the unit you're casting it on and so on. So it's a very safe pick in that respect. So you can see here in the battle we've been trading Spirit Leeches here, and my dragons are taking a little bit of damage. We're going to dive down onto this Chaos Chariot here and immediately just crush 1 unit model, then get back up into the air before these other units respond too much. But we are taking quite a bit of damage here. I've got the Way Watchers also on station kind of picking away, and the idea with this army is we want to skirmish for as long as possible. But you can see I'm constantly running my dragons back towards this forest here. That's so I can get in range of the Spellsinger Lore of Life and start to drop some Earthbloods and Regrowths. Healing spells are going to be most useful when used on low model count units. Of course, Earthblood has an area of effect, so you're definitely going to want to cast it on a big blob if possible, multiple units. But the lower model count, the more efficient that Lore of Life is going to be, because Lore of Life doesn't resurrect unit models necessarily like some other healing spells that we'll take a look at later. doesn't actually resurrect unit models, so you want to try and use it on lower model count units, and of course single entity model count of course are going to be perfect targets for that. So these forest dragons, you can see this one in particular is getting pretty low, so we're going to fly back and just negate a lot of the damage that's been done with the Lore of Death spells so far. We did catch that Chaos Sorcerer Lord, so I'm going to go in for a little bit of a risky maneuver here and try and take out this Chaos Lord while we have that Prey of Anathema up. We're pouring in the Waywatcher Fire. I'm going to be moving in with the dragons as well, but deciding at the last moment, you know, there's a lot of missile fire in the air. I really don't want to take that head up, so we're going to fly back and get some healing from the Spell Singer there. So again, just kind of trying to kite things out a little bit. Got these Wild Riders up and around. Since my opponent really only has these Marauders and they're focused on dealing with my dragons, I can kind of use my Wild Riders to come up and around and maybe poke away at this infantry formation a little bit here, especially those Forsaken. They do have 75 armor, which is pretty solid, but it's not the most. You can see more Spirit Leeches being dropped on that Glade Lord, and again, that's guaranteed damage. Granted, Spirit Leech and Fate of Buna are going to be the most efficient against factions with healing, but I'm not sure exactly what the damage scaling is. I would need to do some testing one-on-one to see, you know, Fate of Buna versus Regrowth, how much damage Fate of Buna does to different types of units versus how much does Regrowth heal. I believe that Regrowth and Earthblood, the scaling, I'm not 100% about this, I need to check, but I believe the scaling is the same regardless of what you cast on, whereas like Spirit Leech and Fate of Buna will scale differently depending on what you cast on. Spirit Leech scales against single model entities specifically, whereas Fate of Buna scales on, I believe, cavalry size or larger is where it's most optimal. You can see we brought in a charge with these Wild Riders. Unfortunately, I'm a little bit busy microing my Air Force, so we're going to leave them in a little bit longer than they should. They're definitely going to get some damage done on these Forsaken. Unfortunately, not the most cost-effective engagement at the end of the day, but they are pinning a lot of these guys in place, allowing these Waywatchers to empty more of their ammunition here. You can see Fate of Buna going off. It's going to do a lot of damage to these Waywatchers. They are a 45 model count unit, which is, you know, a standard cavalry size, even though they're an infantry skirmisher. Relatively low model count, so that is going to deal a lot of damage to them. And just watch as this Fate of Buna just tears away the hit points of these Waywatchers, and that's why Fate of Buna is such a popular spell, because it does a lot of damage and it's guaranteed direct damage. Granted, not as flashy as like a big Vortex or a Wind of Death or something like that, but it is going to get the damage done. You can see through attrition here, through this long skirmish phase, we've been able to get the Dragon Breaths and the you know, the continuous missile fire from the Gladian, from these Waywatchers and so on, and we've downed the Chaos Lord here, so that's going to set things very much in our favor from the get-go. And now my opponent's infantry force is starting to finally make its way over to where we're hidden here. And again, we're just going to be flying back. You see that template pop up for that Earthblood, catching both those dragons, going to be healing those hit points. It is worth noting that all units do have a healing cap, which is denoted by this little teardrop-shaped health icon here. If you mouse over it, it'll tell you how much healing cap a given unit has left. You can see this dragon has about 1800 hit points that it has the potential to regenerate if given healing spells and so on. So you can only ever regenerate a certain amount of HP per unit. But if you get a unit to its healing cap, you've gotten a lot of value out of your healing, and hopefully you've been getting value out of that unit as well. Hopefully that's not just you hitting the panic button because you mismicroed something, which is another thing that healing allows you to do. You know, if you mess up, if you mismicro something, or if you take a lot of damage on a very key unit, that healing allows you to heal them back and come back into the fight. It's one thing that makes a faction like the Lizardmen so strong. Granted, they don't actually have access to Lore of Life directly, but they have a lot of various different healing mechanics. And factions that do have access to Lore of Life, Bretonia, for example, a Bretonian Death Star can be very scary with Grail Guardians of the Fey Enchantress. You know, various different strategies like that. So I definitely think that Lore of Life is a go-to in a lot of situations. It may not be the go-to in every situation, although it is useful in just about any situation, I would say. There are some matchups and you know, different setups that you can run where you don't necessarily have to take Lore of Life, or it may be more optimal to take something else. We'll kind of talk about things a little bit in the end screen. Likewise, for factions with access to Lore of Death, it's going to be one of the most cost-effective Lores of Magic that you can bring to the table. It, you know, that guaranteed direct damage can be very powerful, particularly against factions which don't have healing. But even if against factions which do have healing, you know, Bretonia and so on, taking out high-value units and trying to assassinate characters with that Spirit Leech can be very powerful. You can see The Chaos Infantry is going to come in, and they'll definitely do some damage here, but since we've got air superiority here, and since most of the missiles from the Marauder Horsemen have been expended, we're going to drop the 2 Forest Dragons down into combat. And man, the Forest Dragon is such a cool model. It's kind of nice that it has the Dragon Breaths now. It seems decent. I'm still not 100% sold on it, but if you bring 2, it definitely gives you enough power to deal with some things. But yeah, I'm glad that the Forest Dragon now in Total War Warhammer 2 is fully realized, has the Dragon Breaths and everything else. Very, very fun stuff. Not something I take too often, so I figured you guys would be interested to see, and we could kind of have the discussion about life and death here. So, you can see the bounce power is pretty heavily in my favor at this point. We're mostly just waiting for army losses to go off, so we'll kind of soak up some cinematic action as these Chaos Warriors and Forsaken fight in the pits against these Eternal Guards here, and the dragons flying overhead. Very beautiful combat here. And even the Glady with her pigeon is getting involved in the melee here. But the Terror is definitely going to be an issue at this point for the Chaos with their lack of leadership, and most of their units are not immune to psychology, so the Terror from the Dragons is definitely going to be a big issue. You can see a general chain route going down, and that is pretty much going to be game. So well played to my opponent there. Hope you guys enjoyed watching. It's a fun battle. Good chance to have a discussion about lore of life and lore of death, and you know, a lot of people may consider them boring. And, you know, I kind of get that to a degree. It is a little bit boring to just always see these same direct damage or healing spells. There's no big flashy effects for them. You know, it's not like a Penumbral Pendulum or a big Vortex spell that has this big flashy effect. It's pretty low-key, but they are, in many cases, the most competitive lores of Magic to take. So let's go ahead and just take a look here. Myself, obviously, the Dragon's doing very well with that healing. They're able to generate a lot of value here, snipe out that Chaos Lord, and then come down and deal damage to the Chaos Infantry. Likewise, Way Watchers helping in that respect as well, as did the Glady, of course, and then the Infantry just kind of cleaning up in the late game there. For my opponent, his Marauder Horsemen were able to generate a lot of value dealing damage to the Dragons, but in the end, the healing is what allowed me to sustain that battle. Otherwise, I would have lost the Dragons to that heavy missile fire, but because of the healing, we're able to stay in that fight and able to kind of soak a lot of the Sorcerer Lord's magic and just rehealing the Spirit Leeches and the Fated Bunas as much as possible, you know, when appropriate. So, in terms of lore of life here, we can go ahead and take a look at it. And the factions with access to lore of life are going to be the Empire, Bretonnia, High Elves. Let's see. Empire, Bretonnia, High Elves, and the Wood Elves. I believe I may have missed one, but I think that's everything. Obviously, the Enchantress is a legendary caster with access to Lore of Life. The other spells here, Awakening in the Wood is an okay-ish damage. It doesn't do that much damage. Mainly, it's useful for the 48% speed debuff, and it also procs the Life Bloom Lore attribute, which is a map-wide replenishment. Doesn't heal that much, but it is something. Flesh to Stone is a plus 60 armor, which is a pretty solid buff. It's only 7 winds of magic too. Pretty underrated spell, depending on the situation and the faction you're playing. If you're the Wood Elves, for example, and you need to tank up a particular unit, that can be a very useful spell. Shield of Thorns is a decent spell, but considering, and this is the issue with a lot of the non-healing spells in Lore of Life, considering you're going to be probably more cost-effective to put your resources, Winds of Magic in a battle is a limited resource, so you're going to be more cost-effective, most likely, to put that into direct healing, rather than trying to buff your troops. But Shield of Thorns is a nice buff. The Sisters of Thorn for the Wood Elves do carry it as a bound spell, which is worth noting, so it's missile resistance and a bit of weapon damage as well, so a nice little buff. Regrowth is the big heal, and then Dwellers Below is a nice area of effect damage spell. It's a little bit bigger than Pit of Shades, similar-ish damage output, probably a little bit less than Pit of Shades, but it does have that 24% speed debuff as well. If you overcast it, it has the potential to do a lot of damage, but yeah. So definitely I would recommend Lore of Life if you're going with a build where you have a Lord that has no way of regenerating. The Branch Wraith does have access to the Earthblood heal, which can make him a decent alternative to the Spellsinger. Likewise, if you're running something like Karl Franz for the Empire, I almost always recommend bringing Lore of Life with Karl Franz, just because he's a little bit of a big target. If you kit him out fully, how I usually do, I'll typically cut, hold the line, and Foe Seeker sometimes, sometimes not, depending on the cost, but even then, about 2,000 resources, and you also don't want to lose your Lord. So because Karl Franz has no innate regeneration, I definitely would recommend taking a healer to help keep him in the fight. Likewise, I typically run him on the ground with the Royal Altdorf Griffites as a bodyguard, so that way you can use that to Earth, Blood, and Regrowth. Likewise on the Altdorf Griffites themselves. Only 24 model count means you're going to be getting pretty efficient heals by dumping your magic into them, as long as you're using it when they still have a high model count. Even in the late game situation when they have a little model count, it can still potentially be useful. Just be sure that you're not wasting, because you know, when they have lesser unit models, they can only heal up to that number of unit models. So for example, if they had half the number of unit models, if they had only 12 instead of 24, they would only be able to regenerate 50% of their HP, because, you know, each model can only heal to its own maximum HP, if that makes sense. So likewise for Lore of Death, if we take a look, Beastmen have Lore of Death, as does Chaos, Vampires, Greenskins, of course, with Azag himself, have access to Lore of Death. So pretty common lore across a lot of different factions. Tomb Kings also have access to Lore of Death with Arkan the Black and even just a Lich Priest. And yeah, pretty common lore across. It's going to be useful in a lot of different situations, particularly for the legendary lords which carry it. So like Arkan the Black, Azag, or even Manfred von Karstein for the vampires also has access to Lore of Death. So it's going to be a good pick for any of them, particularly with someone like the vampires. Fate of Buna is going to give you a reliable way to deal with elite tier infantry. Now granted, it is a little bit risky because it's a lot of Winds of Magic, and the vampires, who we'll talk about in another video, they have their own special lore of magic. Lore of vampires, what would you know? It's very, very important for kind of stabilizing their army and supporting it and keeping it going. So it's a little bit of a risk reward to even put the Winds of Magic into Fate of Buna to begin with. But if you are going to spend that magic on damage rather than healing or support, it's nice to be able to have that direct damage option in Fate of Buna. Lore of Death also has some other really nice spells that maybe we'll take a look at another time. In particular, Aspect of Dread Knight gives terror and leadership to a certain unit, which can be very useful if you're trying to terror bomb but you don't have a terror-causing unit nearby. Likewise, Doom and Darkness is a -16 leadership, and if you overcast it, gives it an area of effect. Can be very, very useful for terror bombing low leadership factions like Skaven, Beastmen, or Greenskins. You drop this overcast Doom and Darkness in an area, charge in with a high shock, a high terror unit, and you can usually get a pretty solid chain route going. Very useful spell. Soul Blight is a really excellent debuff. Anytime you can get an area of effect armor debuff, it's useful. -25% weapon damage is always nice as well. Purple Sun is a very, very powerful vortex. It's pretty expensive, but it can do a ton of damage. Just be sure that you're casting it into an appropriate area. Like with all vortex, can be vortexes, vortexes, I'm not sure. But anyway, it can be very, very useful, but is a pretty big risk to cast as well, because of course it might fall onto your own troops. And so there is that, and that's pretty much it for Life and Death here. So let me know in your comments down below, what are your thoughts on the Lore of Life and Lore of Death here? What do you want me to cover in more detail about these lores of magic, anything specifically? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Hope you guys enjoyed watching. If you like this kind of content, like and subscribe. I'm keeping it coming with more Total War Warhammer 2 content every single day, so stay tuned for more, and we'll see you next time.